All right. It is Wednesday, May 18th, 2022. It is time for the Digital Roundtable. We have a great guest today. But before we get rolling, we have our very own Dr. John Sibley Butler with the guitar.
Well, I know it's kind of late. I hope I didn't wake you, but what I got to say can't wait. I know you'd understand. Every time I tried to tell you, the words just came out wrong. So I'll have to say I love you in a song.
Well done, Johnny. So John Butler, the semester I think is over. Grades maybe are lingering by some students and teacher confrontations. And you know, today is another glorious day. I happen to be in Oklahoma City, not at Pebble Beach, but I'm pretending I'm at Pebble Beach. And the market is melting down. Inflation is crazy. Oil is crazy. The stimulus infrastructure funding money has spearheaded all kinds of crazy behaviors. What say you, Johnny Butler?
What I say is that in the great state of Texas, summer got here overnight. We had the same analog that happened with the snow with the heat. So in South Austin, we had to shut down part of the grid to survive the heat. And not only is the stock market melting down, the question is, will the grid hold up? You're exactly right. I turned the television on and the stock market is going through a meltdown. Futures melting down. And of course, people are selling stocks and getting into bonds. And then all of that, of course, all relates to the uncertainty of the world, from the supply chain to the war, the conflict in Europe, and more importantly, our perceptions of how that will be addressed. So we're in an interesting situation here in America. All of the things that are predictable are non-predictable. All the things that we should look forward to are changing. And then, of course, the business models themselves are changing tremendously. We have the issue of people not wanting to go back to work. We have the people who want to work at home. We have the issue of the universities trying to figure out what the model would be in the future. But what is certain is this: for those of us who are smart and understand business models, then we can create business models to help us preserve and to predict the future.
Yeah. Well said. Llewellyn King, how are you, sir?
Very well. We have a large problem out there, which is oil. It's a big driver of inflation, and it's largely because not so much of a shortage of crude, but a shortage of refining, which has been hit with a double whammy. First off, Russia was a large supplier of diesel, of what loosely is called product, but of the refined products that came out of Russia, diesel was very, very important. The second one is during the pandemic, the refineries were allowed to run down. They were not necessarily well maintained. O&M, always the first victim, fell predictably victim. And because supply was low, they weren't needed. Now we have to ramp up somewhat the supply of crude oil, but very much our ability to refine it into the products that are needed in the market. Oil today in many places, I'll take that again. Gasoline in many places exceeded $6. I think that's true all through California. Around here where I am in Rhode Island, also known as East Texas, to Johnny Sibley Butler, who's a little confused about geography. The price is around close to $5. This is going to put a huge spur to inflation, and it's going to crimp a lot of economic activity. Eventually, you'll get what always happens, and how the market will work is, as Norman McRae of The Economist used to say, the supply will go up and the consumption will go down. But there'll be a lot of hurt along the way to that happy equilibrium.
Yeah, yeah, well said. CNBC was saying today that for the first time, $4 gas or more was present in all the states of the United States of the Union for the first time in history. I find that to be an amazing stat, but nevertheless. So we have a great guest today, and I'll get to introduce him in a moment formally, but let's say hello to Dr. Ken Wisian. Well, Ken, how are you, sir?
Doing good. Looking
It,
forward.
it looks like you are in some geothermal place.
It's just beautiful West Texas scenery. Desolate beauty.
But he is a
Excellent.
hook'em horn. He's a hook'em horn, so let's make that clear.
I'm
There you go, there
second
you go.
generation UT. I got my bachelor's here. I've got pretty deep UT roots.
Yeah, let me introduce you quickly for those that are watching and listening and don't know you. So Ken is the Associate Director of Environmental Division in the Bureau of Economic Geology at the Great University of Texas at Austin. And in addition to that, he is also a retired Major General at the US Air Force. He's going to be with us for an hour, and we're going to talk about energy and geothermal and many other things, perhaps Top Gun even. Prior to his current role within UT, he was also the Executive Director of Disaster Research Program. And then prior to UT, he was a consultant at the Institute of Defense Analysis, a Senior Deputy Director for Coastal Protection at the Texas General Land Office, and obviously, as I said earlier, Major General and Commander at USAF, Texas Air National Guard. Ken holds a BA in Physics from the University of Texas at Austin, an MS in Geology from Centenary College of Louisiana. And he holds a test pilot license from the US Air Force, and he also has an MSS in Strategic Studies from the US Army War College, and last but not least, a PhD in Geophysics from SMU, also known as the Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Welcome, Ken, to the show.
Thank you, Andrews. Glad to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Ken, you have a different perspective in life than many others. Well-educated human being, doing some cool things at UT now on research in geology. Tell us real quick, we have a theme, a hypothesis here in the show now running for 2 years that this whole transformation with the pandemic has accelerated digitalization of things, telecommuting, all these, accelerated things that, technology has been around forever, but the adoption of these things is really now accelerating dramatically. Any thoughts and takes from your point of view on the impact of COVID, good, bad, or indifferent, as it relates to acceleration of new thoughts and energy and the usage, and maybe even the university and what's going on in your world?
Yes, I think it's spurred some creativity.
Mhm.
People have had time, maybe more than they're used to daydream, think outside the box. And I think that's had a noticeable impact. It's hard to separate that from converging technology trends that have really are revolutionizing my field, which is geothermal energy. But yes, it's clearly there. And, frankly, as a scientist, it's fascinating to think that we're in the middle of a massive worldwide experiment on what's work going to look like in the future.
Right.
And
right.
we haven't figured out. It's going to take a generation to figure that out.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to observe and to realize you're in the middle of it right now.
Yeah. So given that, let me give you a quick premise on something and then comment on that, and then we'll go around and start our questioning. So a lot of people keep saying that the answer to our problems is obviously decarbonization because of climate change, and we need to be efficient in conservation and all these things. And I personally, I understand that you got to be a good steward and you shouldn't leave the water running if you're not in the sink washing your hands. But I think that, we need to find a way to live in a world of abundance and obviously sustainable abundance and non-harmful abundance. And I talk to people about, the electrification of transportation and how ERCOT on the power side with electricity and multiple sources of energy, fuel, it's an 80 gigawatt region. And if we were to convert the 22 million vehicles in Texas to electric, let's say over a weekend, and put 100 kilowatt hour battery on each of them, we would need, if they were going to charge at the same time, which won't happen, and we know all that, but let's just fantasize that would be 2,200 gigawatts. So at some point, we're going to have to realize that the 80 gigawatts that we get today is not enough if we're going to really move everything to electricity. And my question to you is, how do you see geothermal coming in as potentially a base load replacement, fixing a lot of the challenges the wind and solar and all these sustainable new ideas have emerged? Geothermal has been around for a long time. So educate us a little bit about what do you think geothermal is possible to get from now, and where do you see it going potentially as part of the whole mix in a much larger way?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, just to make sure everybody's on the same level, when I'm saying geothermal energy, I'm not talking, your ground return heat pump for a house. We're talking typically drilling down 1 kilometer or more into the earth to tap relatively high temperatures, boiling temperature or higher generally, and use that heat to generate electricity. So that's my focus is the power of the heat of the earth to generate electricity. You can also use it for heating and cooling, industrial processes and other things, but my focus is the higher grade power. So also though, as a military guy, I believe in probing on a lot of fronts and then exploiting what works. I don't see geothermal as the absolute be all end all, that all our power will come from geothermal in a century. But I think it's a powerful component of the best possible balances and mixtures going forward, because we need everything we can get, frankly, especially over the nearer to midterm as we try to decarbonize, which we do need to do. But it's one of a mix. So geothermal's been around as an electricity generator for over a century. It started at a place called Larderello, Italy, which has been running for over a century now. California has the biggest single geothermal plant called the Geysers. It's actually, I think, 12 or 15 different plants scattered over a large area. And that produces about 880 megawatts on an average basis. And that's been running since 1960. So geothermal, in a conventional sense, is a mature technology. It's well proven, but it's limited in where you can do it. You have to go where there's basically volcanic activity or some other high energy geology going on. What's changing now is the convergence of technology on improving converting heat to electricity and advances in oil and gas technology, particularly directional drilling, fast drilling, that kind of thing. Those two things coming together, I would say, create a new paradigm that's emerging right now. And that is to be able to drill anywhere, drill deep, 1 to 10 kilometers, get to high enough temperatures and generate electricity. And so that breaks that geographic constraint and opens up essentially almost the entire Earth's surface to geothermal power generation.
Right.
So that's where we are now. We're essentially in this emerging industry. The ball is mostly in the court of startups. They're leading the charge. And we're in the proof of concept prototype stage. For now, in about the next year or two, we'll see many different engineering methods tested out. And so the picture will clarify a lot as to what's going to work, what are going to be the price points and that kind of thing. But I think you could see a quick scaling up of geothermal to producing a measurable percentage, 10, 20% of our grid in a decade if we wanted to. Right now, it's about less than 0.5% of the US grid.
Right.
We're the biggest geothermal producer in the world, but we produce so much electricity that's just a tiny fraction of our grid.
Yeah. Yeah. Guys?
Yeah, Ken, first of all, welcome to the University of Texas at Austin. And on behalf of myself and John Butler, who runs our Energy Center, we would like to say we look forward to working with you. My question is about the research that we do in universities. I used to have this conversation with Robert W. Cohn, who was a 4-star military. He was a former student of mine who died of cancer, unfortunately. There's a lot of research that's being done in the context of the university. And I know that the military, I was a consultant for DOD for many years, the military itself is utilizing a lot of the research. My question is, once you get to the point where the startups, as you would say, have established the principles that has been tested, how do we move this new technology to the larger society?
Okay.
So to me, it's not a question of what we have. It's a question of what we have sitting on the shelf. And, you know, we have, I mean, people will be frightened by the amount of technology, for example, that the military has and America has and what we can do. But on the energy side, there's so much sitting on the shelf. So my question to you is, how do we move it not only to the larger society, but also to the fighting force as we move around the globe?
Well, a great question. And it really brings me to a point I've been pushing for a couple of years now, which is, you know, in this case, geothermal energy. It's an emerging new technology. The first generation is going to not be cost competitive with other power sources.
Mm-hmm.
So I have actually deliberately focused on getting the Department of Defense to be the early adopter. And because for mission essential power, you can afford to pay a premium. And so, and the military's done a lot of first adopter technologies in the past and resulted in building great industrial bases for us.
Mm-hmm.
I see this as being exactly that kind of situation again. And in fact, the most applied project I've got going right now is an Air Force funded project under AFWorks. It's a STTR, Science Technology Transfer something or another, kind of like a small business innovation research program.
Mm-hmm.
But it's as an STTR deliberately teams up an academic institution, University of Texas, with, in this case, a startup, Sage Geosystems. And we're in the design phase of putting in a 3 megawatt geothermal power plant at Ellington Field on the south side of Houston. So, I mean, it is hitting those points of, you've got a need for mission essential power. And in fact, all military worldwide has a huge strategic vulnerability in depending on civilian power grids.
Right.
And the Department of Defense has that too. So the fact that we could do this, I think, inside a base where you can guarantee your security,
Yeah.
and provide the base load power is a good deal. And so far, you know, that's the case. We got to find more DoD sponsors to move into phase 3. But if we can get there and get the rest of the funding, then we can be up and running in less than 2 years. And that would be the first geothermal plant, commercial, east of the Rockies in the US, because it's outside that normal geologic active zone. So I started rambling there, but basically, yes, the Department of Defense is used to being the first adopter of new technologies. They've realized now that they don't necessarily drive the creation of the new technologies, but they can enable them. And so this project that funds my work and this startup in Houston is part of a very innovative ecosystem that the Department of Defense has created to do initial fundings. And it involves programs like AFWorks for the Air Force, Defense Innovation Unit, Army Futures Command, and those kind of things.
Let me follow up. That's great. Let me just follow up with a question. One of the things that's, you know, I'm a Vietnam veteran, that we always feared that if we threw a Coke can away, it would come back to us as a weapon. And one of the great things we've had, we have a lot of battery operated stuff, and we definitely don't want to throw batteries away. So my question is there any way to hook up the technology and to the warfighter, such that when the battery is done or whatever is done, you don't have to throw it away and it comes back to you in a bomb or something? So if you look at, we were messing around with in the military with the technology where the human body, the energy from the human body would actually, recharge all of the cell phone and recharge all the batteries that operate what we need to operate. Have you thought about how to connect technologically the rewards of the thermonuclear, not nuclear, the thermal energy, geothermal energy to the warfighter himself or herself?
Yes. It can be done under the right circumstances, but to create these kind of geothermal power units, you still have to drill a fair ways into the earth. And so that's your limiting factor, is you still need essentially a full-size drilling rig to create the plumbing system to draw this power out. Once you're done, the footprint is the size of my office for 10 megawatts. So that's not a factor. But could you do this at forward operating bases in a combat zone? Well, I think I've landed at every one of them in Iraq and Afghanistan over the years. And the bigger ones, yeah, I think you could safely get a drilling rig in and do it and then get that out and bury your generator. A small company, battalion size, FOB, forward operating base, it would need some other new technology. And there are other interesting auxiliary technologies that are really in the very low technology readiness level stage, but things that would allow you to drill maybe a lot easier. So there's microwave-based drilling methods. Obviously, I think there's laser-based. There's a hypersonic drilling startup going, and there's another one that does like shotgun ball bearing things to drill through.
What
So
about
a lot of different methods that might allow you to drill without having that 4-story tall drilling rig to support it.
What about a drill drone? What about a drill drone?
A drill drone?
Yeah.
Say that 3 times fast. Well, if
needs a lot of fuel, obviously.
Yeah, that tells me probably shape charges, but there's only so deep you can go, and you still need to vacuum out debris out of your hole and get it out of the way. That's probably one of the limiting factors on all these new technologies. Is you can create a hole, but you're going to be filling it with debris. How do you get it out of the way? We
need to study gophers, right? So go ahead, Llewellyn.
Well, they're automated, and from the military perspective too, I've got to get this paper out. I've been piddling around with it for a long time, but I think there's good potential for doing some variations on geothermal energy on the moon.
Yeah.
And even on further out in the solar system.
Yeah.
Ken, this is first, I'd like to welcome you. It's so exciting to have you on the broadcast. And secondly, I wondered if you were familiar with the experience at Los Alamos with the hot rocks program there in the 70s. I covered that very intensely and got quite involved with it in a way, because Sig Hecker, who was the director of Los Alamos at the time, tried to get me to push it, and Stuart Udall was interested. And so it had a lot of friends, but some terrible mistakes were made. First, they tried to drill the holes themselves, and of course we didn't have horizontal, we only had vertical. In the end, they got the oil companies in, which they should have done. Then they found that some of their expectations were wrong. First of all, they could get the brine to the surface, they pump water down into the hot rocks at a decent temperature to operate a turbine with enough steam, but they didn't have a way of disposing of the polluted brine. So they didn't know what to do with it. So they changed gears and they said, well, we'll put a heat exchanger down the hole. Well, the problem was the loss, the inefficiency of heat exchangers being as they are, the steam wasn't hot enough and it reached the surface. And finally, they took every measurement you could imagine. They knew everything about that hole, everything that lived in the earth. They knew the tiniest sub-microbe, but they never calculated the life of the reservoir. So when they tried to interest the people from California who operated the geyser plants, they just laughed at them. They said, there's only one number we need, or two really, the heat of the steam and the life of the reservoir, neither of which they could answer. And sadly, the whole thing fell apart. There was a final meeting in Santa Fe. I was there because Hecker asked me to come out. And the commercial people just tore into these wonderful scientists from Los Alamos who hadn't answered the right questions. They had a lot of answers for the wrong questions. So I just mentioned that this was a very interesting initial go at hot rocks.
Mhm. Well, and actually, federal funding in the Department of Energy for hot, dry rock technology development continues to the present day. It's been one of the main focuses on trying to step out from the conventional technology, but it's been lacking some things, and many of which you hit on here. You know, the one of the key technologies that's coming to play in making this possible now is the oil and gas industry's knowledge. And by the way, it's a great pivot. 80 to 90% of the current conventional energy industry's knowledge, skill set, and equipment can apply directly into geothermal. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons we could achieve scale up very quick if we really wanted to. Think of during the frac boom here last decade, we were drilling just in Texas alone 15,000 wells a year. Well, if you can get 2 megawatts per well, you know, that gives you a starting frame of reference. So the new paradigm that's emerging is all about closed loop systems. So they are very much not trying to produce the fluids that might be in the rocks already. The idea is that either you stimulate fractures or you drill a complex radiator pattern in the ground, and then you flow your own fluid through that whole system. You hoover up the heat with that fluid, bring it back up to the surface, run it through a generator, re-inject it back in, and start the whole loop over again. So it's closed loop is the idea there. And so one, you're not emitting anything into the atmosphere. Two, you control the flow system, so you can use your own engineered fluids. Water has been the standard up till now, but actually in the last 20 years or so, using heat exchangers, organic Rankine cycle generators have come on strong with the lower temperatures. That uses a fluid like butane or pentane that's better at flashing through a turbine and turning the turbine than water is. And now the leading edge of research is on supercritical CO2. So you actually would be using carbon dioxide in a closed loop, because it's very efficient at low temperatures, to cycle that through the rocks, suck up the heat, bring it up to the surface, and go back around again.
What sort of temperatures are you talking about?
Another good question. Right now, if you can get to 150 C centigrade, which is about 300 Fahrenheit, you're in solid commercial territory. You know, if you're only a few kilometers.
That was where Los Alamos got to.
Yep.
They had that temperature, but they didn't have I mean, they just didn't answer all the questions. And of course, they were very far from building a power plant.
Well, nowadays at 150 C, you can get, if you can get that or pretty close to it up the surface, you're well within the technology of generating power. But that lower temperature limit is coming down continuously and is an active area of research. And bear in mind too, how much power you generate is dependent on the temperature of your source and your ambient outside temperature. So the same heat source in Alaska will generate a fair amount more power than the same source in Texas with a hotter outside air temperature.
Right.
Yeah, this is really good. I'm sorry. Let me ask one more question, if I may, Andreas. Can you visualize the whole idea that Andreas' research at one time underneath the city of Austin will hook up to your technology to help us run the city of Austin? Can you imagine the plants being underneath the ground and going directly to our power plants? Generation.
It may not be in the first wave, because the ground under Austin here is not very warm. So you'd have to go deeper, and that how deep you go is what really is the biggest driver of the cost. So you start off in easier areas like Houston, where we're thinking probably 5 kilometers deep. And there's many other areas all through the middle of the US that are similar. So yeah, I can definitely see it being technologically and economically viable at some point in the relatively near future, but not right off the bat.
Yeah, Ken, is there such a mapping is such an important element to our modern life, Google Maps, satellite mapping from the Department of Defense all these years. Is there such a thing as a geo map that would show me the depth in the country, and where I can get to, let's say, 150 feet?
Yes.
Is there such a map? Does it exist, or you have to actually do that every time you're drilling yourself?
Well, it does exist. For instance, north of the US as a whole, but it's not at the resolution to actually do a project on. So it'd give you a general idea. But if you Google SMU Geothermal Laboratory, you can get to these maps that are publicly available. I worked on the first generation of them when I was doing my PhD. That will show you the temperature depth for the lower 48 at, I don't remember the exact depths, but like 3, 5, 8, and 10 kilometers down. And you can see what the best estimate of the temperature is. I'll put it that way.
Right.
Now, for instance, here in Texas, I'm working on the side, essentially, on using the vast amount of oil and gas data to map Texas's temperature at depth county by county.
Wow.
And get a much more accurate picture, one that's pretty close to being accurate enough to base a project on. It needs to be funded explicitly so I could do the whole state in less than a decade, but it's there. And there's new projects that are brewing that want to go after this approach for the whole world at different scales. So there's a lot happening. In fact, there's so much happening in geothermal, it's hard to keep up with, because it's been a niche, a tiny niche for decades.
But how come a place like Hawaii, and they suffer with trying to put a grid and the solar, they got geothermal. They could solve the whole problem in 10 seconds. Why aren't they doing it?
They do have a little bit of geothermal power, and I do believe there's a new project brewing finally for the first time in, I think, a few decades there. But they also have very tight environmental restraints on development. But geothermal is really good particularly good besides military bases and critical infrastructure for relatively remote locations where it's very expensive to ship in fossil fuel. And Hawaii in particular, it's volcanically active. There is a lot of resource there.
So in addition to asking you about Hawaii because of the volcanic activity, I mean, every island, you don't want to ship things. Why aren't they? I'm just shocked that this is not moved farther ahead. And let me ask you another question real quick on the comment on the islands too. Is there money in the current infrastructure bill for geothermal anything?
A little bit. A small fraction compared to what's in there for water, for carbon sequestration and other things.
Right.
On the other hand, the government has been the main funder of geothermal research for decades and decades. But now, again, things are changing quick. So although the big industry and the big investment vehicles are still not quite yet convinced of ROI, they're all watching really closely. They haven't jumped yet. But on a smaller scale, investment, venture capital, whatever, is there looking for green energy to invest in. And the startups, and there's about a dozen that are really leading this effort, have not had significant problem raising funding to the extent that, Series B for one company beats the entire federal geothermal budget.
Oh, wow.
So it gives you an idea of what's driving this. It's the commercial private side.
Sure.
Academics is supporting it in a strong way with partnerships.
Let me ask you about the science. If I can recall, Germany Germany was one of the most advanced countries scientifically in the world before they got in the battle with us in World War II. But I think that the Germans, in addition to jet planes, which they produce, in addition to our space program that they produce, I think the Germans were also well ahead of the entire world on geothermal technology and the application. if we were to go back and look at that science and look at the scientific papers that were written, like we did with jet aircraft and like we did with our space program and rockets and et cetera, what do we learn? I mean, because we're not the first country to really get involved. In modern country to get involved with geothermal energy. What can we learn from the early scientists, early German scientists, just like we learned from space and jet aircraft?
I would say we've already learned it. Europe is very much into geothermal energy. They've got projects going too, and they are significantly ahead of the US in using lower temperature geothermal heat for heating their cities. Iceland heats their roads and keeps them ice free with geothermal heat. Germany, the Paris Basin draw a lot of their heating from sub 100 degree C water. So Europe is farther along in that area. They haven't had, except when you go far to the southern part of Europe, the kind of conventional geothermal resources that are really good for generating electricity. So they've been a little low on that end, but still definite leaders in geothermal, and the European companies are pushing really hard on the technology and starting to get more involved to a large extent because they see ESG drive from their shareholders, they see government, they see just the demand by the public for the decarbonization.
And the conversion to electricity. I mean, of course, that comes with it, of course. Okay. Well, thank you.
Ken, you raise a very interesting point. The Europeans using low-grade heat for other purposes, district heating. You can use it for greenhouses. They call these new greenhouses polytunnels. They have a lot of them. But I've always wondered whether we couldn't generate the geothermal in situ. So rather than having to bring the steam to the surface, we could generate it down the hole, and that would be a lot more efficient to bring it up on a wire than it would to bring it up in a pipe.
Yep.
And I wonder, we did have a program on which was sort of concurrent with the hot rocks in Los Alamos, but it was done by Livermore, which was in situ coal gasification, and it was funded until about 3 years ago, as far as I know, till gas became a dirty word.
Well, yes, I think that's a viable approach, and to some extent, we're still sidestepping it with just doing a more efficient ways of bringing the heat up to the surface. But yeah, it's definitely a possibility, and there's a whole nother technology besides having to spin things to generate electricity, which is thermocouples. And that technology has advanced a lot. All our deep space probes use thermocouples off the cold and hot side of a radioactive battery, basically, to generate heat. And it's an area I want to learn a little bit more about, is what's the state of the art on thermocouple. But yeah, there's possibilities there. Very small turbines. Again, when you're using supercritical CO2, the size of the turbine needed to generate an equivalent amount of power compared to a water-driven turbine is a tiny fraction, like maybe 10% or so. So yeah, there's possibilities. I mean, I have a house in Fort Worth, Texas, where the water pump is down at the bottom of the well. It kind of the same principle, but it'd be a little more complicated to put a power generator down there. You'd have to pull it up when you need to repair it or do maintenance. But is that any worse than putting the generator on top of a 300-foot wind tower?
No.
Maintenance there is proven, unfortunately, rather expensive.
Yeah.
Ken, you sound like Nikola Tesla as we go forward here. And
well, thank you. Hopefully I don't go quite as crazy, though.
Because, Nikola believed, and Llewellyn, when you go back to the hot rock theory, et cetera, I read a lot of Nikola. Now, he believed, of course, there was enough energy down there underneath to really, really power everything in the world. And so you go back and read his scientific papers. And of course, when he died, the FBI came and got all of these scientific papers from his apartment in New York. My question is, are we heading toward Nikola's theories now when it comes to the relationship between what's down there and hot dry rocks and geothermal? because he explored all of that in his research. And he argued, for example, you remember the research where he argued that he put an electrical light over here in Colorado and took everything underground, and the light started to lit up in Colorado, with his going underneath, to argue that the earth itself could generate electricity. I mean, where are we moving?
Well,
is he going to become another genius?
I don't know the complete answer to that, because I'm not as well versed on most of his work as I think you are. But one, there are natural electric currents in the earth. In fact, geologists use them it's one of the methods we use to try to infer what the structure is deep underground, both with natural currents and induced currents.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as there being enough power down there, yes, the earth radiates out from the core out through the surface of the earth into space about 44 terawatts continuously.
Wow.
So that's the continuous load, but that's small compared to how much heat energy is stored in the upper 10 kilometers of the crust of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
The rocks are actually a very good heat battery. And multiple studies have estimated that there is probably several thousand years worth of extractable heat in the upper 10 kilometers of the crust to meet our current energy demand for several thousand years.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of heat there if we perfect the technology to tap into it.
That's
I'd like to ask you an off-the-wall question, which just has occurred to me quite a bit, and that is, what is the environmental impact on the earth of all the things we want to do in it and stick in it? I started thinking about this with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, where we're going to put unbelievable quantities of carbon dioxide into the earth. We used to think the air was absolutely survivable, and we thought the oceans were immortal, and we found they're all subject to environmental degradation. Is there environmental degradation taking place in the earth?
Well, from a geothermal energy perspective, there isn't currently. If we were to produce energy at a significant scale for hundreds or 1,000 years, then yes, it would start to have some impact. I don't see personally geothermal being a primary energy source for that long. Like everyone else for almost my entire life, I've thought that fusion was 20 years from now, and that will solve our problems. So I still kind of think that way, maybe with a little bit of a grain of salt, but there's multiple other technologies that I think will come on long before we get to the point of really sucking a significant portion of heat out of the crust. The main impact that you would have there would be perhaps some thermal shrinkage, which could cause subsidence or some quakes, and also just changing the heat balance could affect some mineral resources, some water resources. Woe be to the whoever's the poor park director at Yellowstone when Old Faithful finally changes its pattern, which will happen whether we intervene or not. But it's those kind of things where you change a tiny little picture, the butterfly effect. But for the foreseeable future, no. And that is with the understanding that, yes, we used to think the oceans and the air were infinite. We've proven that's not the case, because we've taken what accumulated essentially 100 million years of stored solar power and dumped it in the form of carbon into our environment in a matter of 100 or 200 years.
Right. Well said. Well said. See, I've been educating my brethren that there is no such a thing as the clean or dirty power. It's also energy storage from the sun. Real quick, Ken, you're talking and I'm envisioning many things. I'm envisioning a drill drone that comes to an embassy, and the drill drone drills and creates, geothermal. There's a plant, you take it down, or the drill drone becomes the power plant itself. And then the embassy doesn't have to be connected to the grid. That's one idea.
Yep.
Another one is, why couldn't we use geothermal as a free energy source to do desalination of water that is becoming an issue? Is anybody doing that?
Is anyone actually doing it right now? I don't know. There's a couple of projects, and I just had a conversation with someone interested in that this morning, using that for powering desal. I mean, again, back to, the first generation of this new paradigm, it's not going to be cost competitive
Right.
with other sources of electricity unless
But the main
unless you
issue,
do all of
but
carbon.
real quick, the main issue is the drilling cost.
That's the biggest single issue. Yes. Now, if you factor in carbon pricing, then maybe you achieve parity much faster. But yes, it's a possibility for that. I've been contacted by Bitcoin miners there's now a lot of pressure for them to get off the grid because they're sucking up so much power.
Right.
Could you do it with geothermal? Yeah, whatever you want to power, creating hydrogen. Yes, you can do it.
Yeah.
Let me throw one more thing out that wasn't asked, but I think is important. Geothermal power in this paradigm is going to be a lot more decentralized than nuclear, coal, or oil and gas. You can get probably on average a couple of megawatts per well. If you drill slanted out in different directions from one well pad, maybe you can get 40 or 50 megawatts at a site, but you're not going to get the half gigawatt or gigawatt scale power plants. So I envision these things being much more organically distributed and incorporated into city planning, into smart grid planning and such than current power sources. Somewhere in between the scale of normal power plants and rooftop solar. Somewhere in between there is where this would fall.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
I talk in my book, in chapter 7 of my book, the Advanced Smart Grid, about this notion of positive energy buildings and every building becoming a power plant. And this is a perfect technology for to make that happen.
If you're building a skyscraper and you've already got
which one of your 60 books? You must distinguish and tell me the title.
The one titled The Advanced Smart Grid.
Oh, the Advanced Smart Grid.
If you're building I don't know, I'm not into this business, but if you're building $1 billion skyscraper and you're already excavating out 4 to 6 stories down, what's the incremental cost of drilling one geothermal well in the basement?
Right, let me just say this. You are at a university that really created, the oil industry in America. That is, it did all of the early exploration. Our scientists at the University of Texas created all the bits to drill. Adele created the technology to put out the oil wells when they caught a fire. So it has a long tradition of contributing to the oil industry in terms of technology. So you are you're sitting in a university which has a long tradition. How do we get the consciousness of the University of Texas and even our engineering and petroleum engineer to have the same kind of consciousness about your institute? Have seminars around it, have the oil companies to come in and have seminars, just like we did in the 1920s and the 1930s. As you know, right there by the stadium, we have number one sitting there that we brought in from when it blew in West Texas, the oil rig, number one. How do we get the same kind of consciousness about the possibilities of letting Texas lead in this area? Well, just like we did in the research in petroleum drilling.
It is actually getting there fairly quickly. How you can move it along is, science is a business in its own way. If you fund it, they will come and they will do science. But geothermal, I'm really seeing a big benefit because people like the idea of producing carbon-free electricity, power. So it's got an extra oomph to it. But yes, I think we're the largest and number one rated petroleum engineering and geology departments in the country. And geothermal is catching on due both to private and public funding of the research. I'm cooperating with petroleum engineering professor on several projects. There's several professors that are now jumping on the engineering side whole hog into geothermal research.
Mhm.
So it is building. Now, when we get over the hump or the activation energy to where the big oil and gas companies actually start kicking major funding into it, that will make a difference. Everyone has established now a group or research group, every one of these companies, that's watching things very closely, if not actively starting to do projects.
Mhm.
But again, we're right at that inflection point. We are
Yeah.
in it right now, and it's going to clarify a lot in the next year or two.
Yeah, you brought it up earlier, but it really, you helped me connect the dots. I mean, it makes a perfect sense that geothermal should be embraced by the oil and gas industry because the drilling expertise, they're the masters of this thing, right?
The
And
drilling, the geology knowledge, the
Yeah, I
entire
mean,
skill set is
yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the startup world that's leading this charge,
Mhm.
it's between 50 and 75% former oil and gas people
Right.
they've seen the light bulb has come on, and they've formed their startups, each with their own proprietary idea of how to do the heat.
Yeah.
And that's what's driving it.
Right.
And again, you go back to Texas and the other technology centers that are leading that charge.
So
Mhm.
what is the best area in America besides Yellowstone where we can tap into it in a very, very quickly?
Well, that would still be the volcanic zones in the Western US.
Yeah. So yeah.
There's still resource to be discovered. It's called blind resource. It doesn't have any manifestation at the top. Up until now, surprisingly, really, the main method of exploration for geothermal has been what I call the Jed Clampett method, where you're walking along and you shoot in the ground and up pops a geyser, or you see fumaroles or something. There hasn't been that much put into how to find the hidden resources on the conventional side. And everything I've talked about is dry rock, basically. The conventional thing that's already producing a few gigawatts in the Western US is all tapping into natural water flow systems and is producing the hot water that's in the ground, either heated by volcanoes or heated by very deep circulation in the Earth's crust and then brought back up to the surface. So the Western US still has the richest environment to tap. But I think the key is to broaden that out and break that mindset that, oh, it's only in the Western US.
Yeah, hot springs made a living making people well, jumping in the hot water that came up from the bowels of the earth. But
that's where you go back 2,000 years on us using geothermal energy.
Right, go back to the ancient. So this is very, very interesting to me because it's right in the belly width, if you will, of future energy, and the energy sector will change. It will change tremendously in the next number of years.
Oh yeah.
And I think that where you are is right in the middle of it. You're a great research university, and I think we can commercialize it and get the consciousness up. And I like the idea of getting in bed, if you will, with the oil and gas because of the stuff. And as to Llewellyn King's great observation, what does this do to Mother Earth? That is, what do we expect? We also did all the different kind of drilling right here at the University of Texas. They call it fracking, right? That came out of our engineering program. Yep. So would there be any protest of people from Maine and New York to fly down here to protest our great success? Llewellyn King's people.
You seem to have forgotten that I come from the deep, deep, deep South.
Oh, you do? I'm sorry, Ken. I'm sorry. He's really African American. He was born in an African country. He throws that in my face.
I want to tell you that Africa has a lot of good geothermal sites.
Yes, it
actually does. Kenya has come on really strong in the last decade and now generates half their electricity from geothermal.
Oh wow,
that's very interesting. There's a site in Zimbabwe at a place called Sabi. They may have changed the name because names have changed, but and the Sabi River, SABI, which had natural hot springs, and of course, Europeans had created baths, etc. but there was a lot of geothermal resource, and the water was very hot. So my assumption is the resource was quite strong. I don't know. I haven't seen any signs.
Let me pause real quick, guys, and plug in our sponsors in our Digital 360 Summit. It is coming up. It's going to be at the JW Marriott downtown, and Llewellyn King and John Butler will be there speaking, and we're going to be promoting a sumo wrestling fight to raise funds for the Geothermal Foundation and others. It's going to be quite the event. We have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce providing a keynote, the Office of the Governor, the Office of the Lieutenant Governor. We have the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office delivering a keynote. We have all kinds of great speakers lined up. These were the speakers that sponsored keynote and spoke in 2021. And we expect a similar cadre of folks and then some. And, you know, the work that we're doing at Texas State University on our Cedar Consortium labs, it's, you know, we just got a internal okay to move forward with our energy and smart utilities lab, which will be doing all kinds of R&D. And then I want to thank Texas State for sponsoring the Digital Roundtable. So Ken, if you could be a God for 30 seconds or Joe Biden for a minute, what will you do to change the landscape? Is it more R&D funding from the government? Are there any roadblocks that get in the way? What would be a catalyst that could take place right away that changes things for geothermal?
Okay. I think a more cooperative funding from the government and the startup world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's actually a surprising, I can rant for hours about what's wrong with the Department of Defense, but I think they've figured out this innovative support for small business pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's starting to export throughout the rest of government. So I would dive into that. And then this really stretches my background, but carbon accounting, carbon pricing.
Okay, that would be an equalizer. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. As a pilot, any thoughts? Are you a Top Gun fan, the movie?
I liked the original when it came out.
Any
It
expectations on
captured
the
the
second
feel
one?
of a dogfight better than most movies do. I haven't seen the new one.
So it's gonna be it's gonna open up in the U.S. next week, I believe. But are you gonna go see it?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
I've been there, done that in real life.
Of course.
I'm telling you, we're gonna relive real life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we could talk for hours with you, and we appreciate you for being here today.
This was
It's
fun.
been
Thank you.
quite educational to know that the Earth emanates 44 terawatts of energy every day. Quite a number. Obviously, it's not as big as how many gigawatts hit the Earth from the sun every day, but
Right.
nonetheless, it's a huge number. And you know, we thank you again, and we'll keep in touch, and hopefully we'll have you again in the show.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. Any parting thoughts, Llewellyn and John?
Well, it's great to hear that hot rocks are alive and well somewhere. And for some reason, I put a lot of time into hot rocks. And somehow the director of the lab at that time thought that I could save the program if I wrote about it. Of course, I couldn't. And they were fabulous scientists, but they really had lost sight of anything to do with commercialization.
Mhm.
When we had a final conference between the commercial operators from the geysers and the hot rocks people from Los Alamos, they weren't on the same page. The commercial people had no confidence in heat exchangers. Los Alamos had too much confidence in heat exchangers. And of course, the whole issue of the quality and the durability of the steam supply out of the well. But I mentioned before, and I think it's very important, we did not have horizontal drilling or any of the things that have changed the oil and gas industries so radically.
Yeah.
What happened in Los Alamos in the 70s certainly doesn't apply, but it's worth noting. And
Yeah.
thank you for coming on. It's a great pleasure to talk to you, Ken.
Yes, and I think we need more case studies from Germany and more or Africa where it's really, really working. That is, look at those, do white papers on things that work, and in the white paper talk about why it should work in America, where it can work in America, and how it could get us to a carbon neutral, carbon accountability, and those kind of things that we need to take a look at. So you're doing a great job, and welcome to the University of Texas family, and look forward to meeting you in person.
Same here. Thank you.
All right, guys. I appreciate you very much. John, take us away.
I'll take you away. Operator, why don't you help me place this call? You see the number on the matchbook is old and faded. She's living in LA with my best old ex-friend Ray. Gosh, she says she's still well and sometimes hated. A little 1960s
done.
for my man.
Well done. Thank you very much.
Mhm.